Hey guys, tonight we step into ancient Rome, the only place where politicians mastered personal branding, athletes collected obsessive fans, and rich people turned dinner parties into publicity campaigns. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you should know about ancient Rome is that it invented influencers nearly 2,000 years before anyone started pointing a camera at themselves and saying, "Hey guys." There were no smartphones, no Wi-Fi, no sponsored protein powder. The closest thing to a viral dance challenge was surviving a gladiator fight with all your limbs still attached. Yet somehow, the Romans became experts at chasing attention anyway. Because here's the secret, people have never really changed. If you were dropped into Rome around the 1st century before Christ, after recovering from the smell, which would probably take a few business days, you'd discover a city absolutely obsessed with being seen. Everyone wanted recognition, everyone wanted admiration, everyone wanted people whispering their name after they walked away. Some things apparently are eternal. Rome wasn't just the capital of an empire. It was home to well over 1 million people packed into narrow streets, towering apartment blocks, noisy markets, temples, workshops, taverns, bathhouses, and enough traffic to make you question whether carts had also discovered rush hour. Every morning, thousands of Romans spilled into the city centre with a mission. Merchants wanted customers, lawyers wanted clients, politicians wanted votes, poets wanted rich sponsors, pickpockets wanted your wallet. You wanted to keep your wallet. Not everyone would achieve their goals. All roads, sooner or later, led to one place, the Roman Forum. Calling it a marketplace hardly does it justice. The Forum was Rome's stage. It was where reputations were built, destroyed, repaired, and occasionally buried. Imagine if Parliament, Wall Street, Times Square, your local shopping centre, and every social media platform were squeezed into one giant open square where everyone talked at the same time. Add wandering goats, pigeons with absolutely no respect for personal space, and a suspicious number of statues of very confident-looking men. Congratulations. You're getting close. As you wander through the Forum, you're surrounded by noise. Senators deliver speeches while trying to appear effortlessly brilliant. Lawyers argue dramatic court cases to crowds who are just as interested in the entertainment as the verdict. Merchants loudly insist they're offering the deal of a lifetime, despite making exactly the same claim yesterday. Friends exchange gossip so quickly you'd swear someone had secretly invented group chats. News doesn't travel by notification, it travels by mouths, and Roman mouths rarely travelled empty. One person hears a rumour, 5 people improve it, 50 people swear they witnessed it personally. By sunset, everyone in Rome knows exactly what happened, including several things that definitely didn't. This constant stream of conversation made one thing incredibly valuable: attention. Romans didn't simply want to be successful. They wanted everyone else to know they were successful. Quiet achievement was nice. Public admiration was considerably better. Your reputation determined almost everything. It could help you win elections, secure business deals, arrange prestigious marriages, attract powerful friends, or convince complete strangers that you were someone worth listening to. Lose that reputation, and rebuilding it could be harder than finding a clean pair of sandals after walking through Rome in the rain. Naturally, ambitious Romans became experts at managing their public image. Politicians practiced speeches until every pause sounded spontaneous. Wealthy families built magnificent houses designed to leave visitors politely pretending they weren't jealous. Military generals celebrated victories with enormous triumphal processions, because apparently defeating foreign armies wasn't enough unless several 100,000 people applauded afterward. Even charity became a performance. A wealthy Roman might pay for new roads, fountains, temples, or public games. Was he generous? Sometimes. Did he also enjoy having his name attached to every impressive project in the city? Without question. The Romans understood something that modern influencers understand perfectly. Visibility creates influence. Influence creates opportunity. Opportunity creates even more visibility. It's a wonderfully efficient cycle, provided nobody catches you doing something spectacularly embarrassing in public. And in Rome, with over 1 million potential eyewitnesses, and a population that treated gossip like an Olympic sport, that was always a very real possibility. As you'll soon discover, some Romans became absolute masters of this game. They built personal brands so powerful that people are still talking about them 2,000 years later, which, when you think about it, is probably the most successful influencer campaign in history. If attention was Rome's currency, reputation was its bank account. You quickly discover that Romans don't simply ask who you are. They ask what people think of you. Those are two very different questions. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your neighbours, your business partners, your political rivals, your future in-laws, and the random man selling olives on the corner are all quietly judging every decision you make. Actually, don't imagine it for too long. It sounds exhausting. For the Romans, however, this wasn't unusual. Reputation sat at the centre of nearly everything they did. A respected name could open doors before you even knocked. A damaged one could slam them shut permanently. The Romans even had several words for different kinds of reputation, because apparently one wasn't enough. There was dignitas, the respect you earned through your achievements, family, and behaviour. There was gloria, the fame that came from great victories or remarkable accomplishments. Then there was fama, your public reputation, the story everyone else told about you once you'd left the room. Notice something. Only one of those actually belonged to you. The others belonged to everyone else. That meant your image wasn't entirely under your control. You could spend years building a respectable life, only for one spectacular mistake to become the only thing anyone remembered. History, unfortunately, has always preferred entertaining stories. This obsession started young. If you belonged to a wealthy Roman family, you grew up surrounded by ancestors who seemed incapable of being modest. Wax masks of distinguished relatives were displayed during funerals. Family homes contained statues celebrating generations of military heroes and successful politicians. Imagine growing up with great-great-grandfather staring at you from the hallway every morning, silently reminding you that he conquered half of Spain before turning 30. No pressure. Failure didn't just disappoint your parents, it disappointed several centuries of dead relatives. Ordinary Romans cared about reputation too, although usually on a smaller scale. A trustworthy merchant attracted more customers. A reliable craftsman found more work. A soldier known for bravery earned promotions. Even your ability to keep promises mattered, because Rome relied heavily on personal relationships rather than paperwork. People remembered everything, especially the embarrassing parts. If you publicly stumbled during an important speech, your rivals would happily remind everyone for years. If you hosted an unforgettable dinner, guests would tell the story across the city. If your expensive new toga accidentally split while climbing the Senate steps, well, let's just say that story wasn't staying private. The remarkable thing is how familiar all of this feels. Today, people spend hours carefully choosing photographs, polishing resumes, or crafting the perfect online profile. Romans achieved the same goal with speeches, clothing, generosity, public appearances, and impressive accomplishments. Different tools. Exactly the same human instinct. And once ambitious Romans realized that reputation could be carefully built instead of simply earned, they began turning self-promotion into an art form. No one mastered that art better than the man waiting just around the corner, Julius Caesar. If ancient Rome had handed out awards for personal branding, Julius Caesar would almost certainly have presented the trophy to himself, and then commissioned 3 statues to commemorate the occasion. By the time Caesar reached middle age, nearly everyone in Rome knew his name. That wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck. It certainly wasn't because he preferred living quietly in the countryside with a nice vegetable garden. Caesar understood something most politicians didn't. Winning wasn't enough. People had to know you were winning. As a young man, he carefully built his public image. He dressed impeccably, gave polished speeches, and somehow managed to make confidence look effortless. Critics claimed he spent too much time adjusting his appearance. One Roman even joked that Caesar scratched his head with a single finger, so he wouldn't ruin his carefully arranged hairstyle. Imagine conquering Gaul, but still worrying about your hair. Some priorities never disappear. His greatest frustration, however, wasn't vanity. It was becoming famous. Rome was overflowing with ambitious nobles, each trying to outshine the next. Simply being rich wasn't impressive. Plenty of people were rich. Simply being brave wasn't enough either. Rome had thousands of brave soldiers. Caesar needed something bigger. He needed a story. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on which side of the battlefield you happened to be standing, the conquest of Gaul provided exactly that. For nearly a decade, Caesar fought campaigns across what is now France, Belgium, parts of Switzerland, and beyond. His victories expanded Roman territory enormously, but the battles themselves were only half the achievement. The other half happened back in Rome. Caesar wrote detailed accounts of his campaigns in a work known today as the Gallic Wars. On the surface, it reads like straightforward military history. In reality, it was brilliant marketing. He referred to himself in the third person, making the narrative sound objective, almost as if an independent observer were calmly documenting events. Caesar did this. Caesar decided that. Caesar defeated the enemy. Conveniently, this mysterious narrator always seemed deeply impressed by Caesar. The books circulated throughout Rome while the wars were still being fought. Citizens who had never left Italy suddenly felt as though they were marching beside their victorious general. Every chapter reinforced the same message. Caesar was fearless. Caesar was brilliant. Caesar was indispensable. Today we'd call it controlling the narrative. The Romans simply called it excellent writing. Caesar didn't stop there. He minted coins bearing his own image while he was still alive, something almost unheard of for a Roman politician. His triumphal processions filled the streets with captured treasure, exotic animals, and defeated kings, creating spectacles that people remembered for decades. Every appearance, every speech, every celebration strengthened his reputation just a little more. He wasn't merely defeating enemies, he was building a brand. By the time many Romans finally realized just how influential Caesar had become, it was already too late. His name had grown larger than almost any office the Republic could offer, and once someone's reputation becomes bigger than the system itself, history has a habit of becoming complicated. Julius Caesar may have mastered self-promotion, but his adopted son, Augustus, perfected something even more powerful. He made branding look effortless. That was no small achievement, considering he had just emerged victorious from years of civil war, in which Romans had spent an impressive amount of time fighting other Romans. If you were hoping for a peaceful retirement after helping save the Republic, you were about a generation too late. Augustus faced an awkward problem. He held more power than anyone else in Rome. But the last man who appeared too powerful had been stabbed 23 times. So perhaps walking around announcing yourself as supreme ruler forever wasn't the best marketing strategy. Instead, Augustus did something brilliant. He convinced people he wasn't really in charge. Officially, he called himself princeps, meaning first citizen. It sounded humble, almost modest, like someone reluctantly volunteering to organize the neighborhood picnic. In reality, he controlled the army, the treasury, foreign policy, and most important political decisions. It was the ancient Roman equivalent of saying, "I'm not the boss," while everyone waits for your permission before doing anything. Augustus understood that image often mattered more than reality. He rarely dressed extravagantly. Ancient writers even claimed he wore simple clothing made by members of his own household. Whether entirely true or slightly polished for public consumption hardly mattered. People believed it, and belief was everything. He also transformed Rome itself into one enormous advertisement. Temples rose across the city, grand public buildings appeared, Elegant forums replaced older structures. Magnificent monuments celebrated peace and prosperity. Everywhere you looked, Rome seemed to whisper the same message. Look what Augustus has given us. The famous saying often attributed to him captures the idea perfectly. I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Perhaps a slight exaggeration. Politicians have occasionally been known to oversell their accomplishments. Even in ancient Rome, architecture became branding. A new temple wasn't simply a place to worship. It was a reminder of who paid for it. A restored road wasn't just convenient. It quietly advertised competent leadership every time someone travelled along it. Coins carried his portrait into every marketplace across the empire. Statues showed him as eternally youthful, calm, and impossibly composed. It's remarkable how marble emperors never seemed to suffer from bad hair days. Augustus also recruited some of Rome's greatest writers. Poets like Virgil and Horace celebrated Rome's glorious future and connected Augustus with legendary heroes from the distant past. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. Rome was destined for greatness, and Augustus just happened to be leading it. Modern governments hire communications teams. Augustus hired poets. Frankly, the poetry was probably more memorable. By the end of his reign, many Romans had lived their entire adult lives under his carefully crafted image of peace, stability, and prosperity. They didn't simply obey Augustus. They trusted the version of Augustus that had been patiently built around them for decades. And once branding extends beyond a single person and starts defining an entire nation, you've reached a level of influence that even today's most successful influencers can only dream about. If you think modern athletes have devoted fan bases, wait until you meet a Roman gladiator. Today, a famous football player might have millions of followers, endorsement deals, and children wearing jerseys with his name on the back. A successful gladiator had much the same thing, minus the jersey, plus the occasional lion. By the 1st century after Christ, gladiatorial games had become one of Rome's greatest obsessions. Tens of thousands of spectators packed enormous amphitheatres, cheering for their favourite fighters with an enthusiasm that would make modern sports crowds seem positively restrained. These weren't anonymous men swinging swords. The best gladiators became genuine celebrities. People knew their names. People debated their fighting styles. People argued over who would win the next match. And just like today, everyone was convinced they would have done much better if they had been in charge. The funny part is that most gladiators weren't expected to fight to the death every time. Training a skilled fighter required years of expensive preparation. Losing one in every match would have been like buying a luxury racehorse and immediately entering it into a demolition derby. Economically speaking, it made absolutely no sense. The owners of gladiator schools invested enormous sums into feeding, training, housing, and protecting their fighters. They became valuable assets, not disposable ones. Success brought extraordinary rewards. Victorious gladiators received prize money, expensive gifts, roaring applause, and something perhaps even more addictive: recognition. Crowds erupted when their favourite fighter entered the arena. Graffiti praising famous gladiators covered walls across Roman cities. Archaeologists have found inscriptions declaring that certain fighters were the delight of the girls, or celebrating impressive winning streaks. Apparently, fan clubs existed long before anyone invented matching t-shirts. Some admirers collected small souvenirs featuring famous gladiators. Others decorated household objects with their images. Wealthy citizens invited celebrated fighters to banquets, simply because having a famous gladiator sitting at your dinner table was an excellent conversation starter. Oh, that's just Marcus, winner of 18 arena victories. No, don't mind the scars. He gets that question a lot. Even Roman women were said to admire successful gladiators enormously. Ancient writers occasionally complained that respectable ladies developed rather enthusiastic crushes on arena champions. To be fair, confidence has always been attractive. Although surviving repeated sword fights probably helped, what made these men fascinating wasn't simply their skill, it was their story. Every appearance in the arena built suspense. Every victory increased their reputation. Every defeat became public discussion. The crowd followed careers almost like an ongoing drama, complete with heroes, rivals, unexpected upsets, and emotional comebacks. Sound familiar? Modern influencers carefully build loyal audiences over years. Gladiators did exactly the same thing. The only difference was that if today's creators lose engagement, they worry about the algorithm. If a gladiator had a bad day, the consequences were considerably more immediate. If gladiators were Rome's sports celebrities, the wealthy elite were the lifestyle influencers. Only instead of posting pictures of vacations, they simply invited you to visit their house and casually reminded you that your entire neighborhood could probably fit inside one of their dining rooms. The Romans had a word for showing off without appearing to show off. Actually, they didn't. They simply called it being successful. By the late Republic and throughout the Empire, the richest Romans competed in a never-ending contest of luxury. Owning beautiful things wasn't enough. Other people had to see them, preferably while pretending not to be impressed. Imagine spending a fortune importing rare marble from Greece, colourful granite from Egypt, and expensive columns from Asia Minor. Could local stone have done the job? Of course. Would anyone gasp when they walked through your front door? Absolutely not. And where's the fun in that? A Roman villa wasn't just a home. It was a carefully designed performance. The entrance was meant to impress visitors before they'd even spoken to the owner. Polished marble floors reflected the sunlight. Walls exploded with colourful frescoes depicting gods, heroes, landscapes, or scenes that politely suggested, "Yes, I can afford artists." Beautiful statues stood in gardens surrounded by fountains, flowers, and carefully trimmed hedges. Every detail whispered the same message. I've done rather well for myself. Actually, Roman houses didn't whisper. They practically hired a trumpet player. Then there were the dinner parties. To a Roman aristocrat, hosting a banquet wasn't simply about feeding guests. It was an opportunity to display wealth, education, sophistication, and excellent taste, or at least expensive taste. Exotic foods appeared one after another. Fresh oysters arrived from distant coasts. Spices travelled thousands of miles from India. Fine wines were poured from elaborate silver vessels. If a guest asked, "Where did you get this?" the host had already won. Even the servants became part of the performance. Wealthy households employed dozens, sometimes hundreds of enslaved workers who prepared food, poured drinks, entertained guests, cleaned the house, and ensured everything appeared effortless. Effortlessness, incidentally, often requires an astonishing amount of effort. Clothing told its own story. A brilliantly white toga signalled status and respectability. Rich purple dye was so expensive that it became closely associated with emperors and the highest ranks of society. Fine jewellery, imported perfumes, elegant hairstyles, and carefully tailored tunics completed the picture. You weren't just getting dressed. You were making an announcement. Some Romans even kept exotic animals to amaze visitors. Peacocks wandered gardens. Rare birds filled luxurious aviaries. Wealthy collectors acquired creatures from Africa or the eastern provinces simply because almost nobody else owned them. Imagine explaining to your neighbour that you imported a leopard purely for decorative purposes. Your homeowner's insurance would have questions. The remarkable thing is that all this luxury served the same purpose as today's carefully curated lifestyles online. People admired it. People talked about it. People wanted to imitate it. Because in ancient Rome, just as today, nothing spreads quite as quickly as the desire to look successful, even if it means spending a little more than you probably should. If you think people today throw extravagant parties just to post photos afterward, the Romans would like some credit. They were doing it first. Only instead of uploading pictures the next morning, they invited the entire city to witness the spectacle in person. One lesson every ambitious Roman politician learned very quickly was this: people love free entertainment, perhaps not as much as free food, but combine the two, and you've practically guaranteed yourself a loyal audience. Rome's elite spent astonishing amounts of money organising public games, chariot races, theatrical performances, gladiator contests, religious festivals, and enormous feasts. At first glance, it looked incredibly generous. Sometimes it genuinely was. Other times it was a very expensive campaign advertisement. Imagine you're running for public office. You could spend hours explaining your policies. Or you could pay for a week of spectacular games featuring exotic animals, famous gladiators, musicians, athletes, free bread, and enough excitement that people keep talking about your generosity for years. Politicians quickly figured out which strategy received louder applause. The answer probably won't surprise you. These public events were called ludi, and over time they became bigger, longer, and increasingly elaborate. Citizens flooded into theatres, circuses, and amphitheatres, many attending free of charge because wealthy officials covered the enormous expense. Of course, those same officials also made sure everyone knew exactly who had paid the bill. Humility was invited. It simply couldn't attend. Victory arches displayed names. Public inscriptions praised benefactors. Ceremonies thanked generous sponsors before enormous crowds. Even if you somehow missed the event itself, someone would almost certainly remind you who had made it possible. Repeatedly. Banquets worked much the same way. A wealthy Roman didn't invite guests over merely to enjoy pleasant conversation. He invited people to witness success. Course after course appeared on beautifully arranged tables, musicians performed between meals, dancers entertained the guests. Rare wines flowed generously enough that by the end of the evening, nearly everyone believed they could probably govern the empire better than the Senate. They couldn't. But confidence has rarely required evidence. The guest list itself became a statement. Invite respected senators, celebrated poets, famous generals, influential merchants, and suddenly your own reputation rises simply because people associate your name with theirs. Networking, it turns out, predates business conferences by quite a comfortable margin. The smartest hosts also understood something psychologists still discuss today. People remember how you made them feel. A guest who enjoyed an unforgettable evening would likely leave speaking highly of the host. Those stories spread through neighborhoods, marketplaces, bathhouses, and eventually the forum itself. One successful banquet could generate weeks of favorable conversation. That's remarkably efficient advertising. By the end of the Republic, ambitious politicians were practically competing to outdo one another with grander celebrations, larger spectacles, and increasingly generous gifts. Sound familiar? Today, influencers host product launches, luxury events, exclusive parties, and carefully staged experiences designed to keep people talking long after they're over. The Romans simply skipped the photo booth. When your guests included 50,000 cheering spectators, word of mouth did the rest. If Rome had a homepage, it was the Forum. Not the Colosseum, not the Senate, not the Emperor's Palace. The Forum was where everyone went to see what everyone else was doing. You arrive just after sunrise and the place is already alive. Shopkeepers are opening their stalls. Lawyers are warming up their voices. Senators are trying to look important before they've even had breakfast. Messengers weave through the crowds carrying official news, while unofficial news spreads much, much faster. Official announcements move at the speed of a man walking. Gossip moves at the speed of panic. Within minutes, you're surrounded by conversations. Did you hear about the governor? I heard Caesar bought another estate. My cousin's friend's barber says the Senate argued for 6 hours yesterday. Whether any of these stories are true is almost beside the point. People are listening. The Forum wasn't simply where Romans exchanged goods. They exchanged information, and information was power. If you think fashion influencers invented the phrase, "What's everyone wearing this season?" the Romans would politely invite you to examine 2,000 years of evidence. Then they'd probably judge your sandals. Appearance mattered enormously in ancient Rome. Long before luxury brands, designer labels, or seasonal collections, clothing announced who you were before you ever opened your mouth. Sometimes it announced who you desperately wanted people to think you were. That worked then about as well as it does now. The simplest example was the toga. Contrary to what films often suggest, Romans didn't wear togas all day while casually strolling around looking philosophical. A toga was heavy, expensive, awkward to put on, and surprisingly inconvenient if you had any intention of doing actual work. Imagine wrapping yourself in several meters of fabric before trying to climb stairs. Suddenly, modern neckties don't seem so unreasonable. The toga was formal wear. It was designed to be seen. A bright, brilliantly white toga suggested dignity and respectability. Senators wore distinctive purple stripes woven into theirs. Generals celebrating triumphs received magnificent embroidered versions. Emperors eventually reserved rich purple garments almost exclusively for themselves because nothing says "I'm in charge," quite like making your favourite colour illegal for everyone else. Purple wasn't chosen randomly. The famous Tyrian purple dye came from tiny sea snails collected along the eastern Mediterranean. Producing enough dye for a single luxurious garment required thousands upon thousands of shells. Expensive hardly begins to describe it. Wearing purple wasn't simply fashion, it was a financial announcement. Hairstyles changed almost as often. Roman women spent hours arranging elaborate curls, braids, and intricate designs that required remarkable skill from professional hairdressers. Noble women eagerly copied the latest imperial fashions. If an empress appeared with a new hairstyle, versions of it soon appeared throughout the city. Apparently, trends spread long before magazines explained them. Men cared too, although many preferred pretending they didn't. A neatly trimmed beard or a perfectly clean shave could signal education, military discipline, or philosophical wisdom depending on the era. Julius Caesar famously worried about thinning hair and often wore a laurel wreath, conveniently disguising the problem while also reminding everyone he'd won enough victories to deserve wearing one. That's either brilliant image management or history's most successful strategic haircut. Probably both. Jewellery, perfumes, cosmetics, embroidered shoes, rings, bracelets, and finely woven fabrics all helped complete the picture. Wealthy Romans imported silk from distant China, despite many conservative writers complaining that it was too extravagant and dangerously fashionable. History also teaches us another eternal truth. Every generation believes the next generation dresses terribly. Roman authors constantly criticized luxurious clothing, elaborate makeup, flashy hairstyles, and young people spending far too much money trying to impress strangers. Some complaints are apparently immortal. By carefully choosing what they wore, how they looked, and what they displayed, fashionable Romans influenced trends across an empire stretching thousands of miles. The mirror may have been made of polished bronze instead of glass, but the desire to look effortlessly impressive reflected exactly the same human instinct. Not every Roman influencer needed a sword, or a fortune, or an enormous villa with 12 fountains and a peacock wandering around for absolutely no practical reason. Some became famous simply because people wanted to hear what they had to say. Rome loved ideas. Well, Rome loved entertaining ideas. If your philosophy was clever, useful, and delivered with enough confidence, audiences gathered quickly. If it was boring, people suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be, usually the baths. Public speaking was one of the greatest forms of entertainment in Roman society. A gifted speaker could attract crowds almost anywhere. Citizens paused their shopping, interrupted conversations, and gathered around simply to listen. Imagine stopping halfway through buying vegetables because someone nearby started explaining the meaning of life. Actually, don't imagine it in a supermarket today. Security would become involved. The greatest orators became celebrities. Perhaps none was more famous than Cicero. His speeches were copied, discussed, admired, criticised, and studied throughout the Republic. People quoted his words long after he had finished speaking. Young politicians copied his style. Rivals tried to answer his arguments. Admirers travelled just to hear him speak. If Cicero had lived today, he probably would have hosted a 3-hour podcast, and somehow still managed to interrupt everyone else. Philosophers attracted devoted followers too. Stoics taught discipline, self-control, and emotional resilience. Epicureans argued that happiness came through simple pleasures and freedom from unnecessary anxiety. Considering modern life, the Epicureans might have suggested spending less time checking your phone every 4 minutes. Reasonable advice. Few of us would listen. Students often followed respected teachers from city to city, eager to hear new lectures and debates. Learning wasn't confined to classrooms. Discussions unfolded in gardens, temples, private homes, and public squares where curious listeners joined in. Good ideas spread remarkably fast, especially controversial ones. Poets enjoyed enormous influence as well. When Virgil published the Aeneid, he wasn't simply telling an adventure story. He was helping shape Rome's identity. His poetry connected Augustus to legendary heroes and gave the empire a glorious origin story that generations would remember. That's considerably more ambitious than writing "just had coffee." Writers like Horace became famous for witty observations about daily life, ambition, friendship, and human foolishness. Juvenal built an entire career complaining about Roman society, proving that criticizing everything has always attracted an audience. Apparently outrage has excellent retention. Even historians became influential figures. Livy didn't merely record events. He chose which stories future generations would remember and which lessons they should draw from Rome's past. In many ways, these thinkers were the content creators of their age. They informed people, they entertained audiences, they started debates, they shaped opinions, and sometimes they completely changed how Romans understood themselves. Long before videos, bookshelves were the algorithms, and if enough people kept recommending your work, your influence could outlive every emperor who ever ruled Rome. Being famous in ancient Rome came with one enormous disadvantage. Everyone knew who you were. At first, that sounds wonderful. Crowds cheer when you arrive. Your name opens doors. People laugh a little too hard at your jokes. Strangers suddenly become lifelong friends, especially if you're paying for dinner. Life seems excellent. Then someone decides they'd rather have your influence than admire it. Welcome to Roman politics. In Rome, reputation was never something you kept safely locked away. It was constantly under attack. Every compliment you received usually came with someone else quietly sharpening a metaphorical knife, sometimes a literal one. The higher your reputation climbed, the more people started watching for the moment you slipped. That wasn't because Romans were unusually cruel. It was because influence was limited. If one politician became wildly popular, his rivals became relatively less important. Every speech that earned applause was applause someone else didn't receive. Every military victory created another national hero. Every successful public appearance made competitors look just a little more ordinary, and nobody enters politics hoping to become ordinary. The Senate, despite its impressive marble surroundings and dignified appearance, often resembled an extremely polite rivalry wrapped inside expensive togas. Officially, senators debated laws. Unofficially, they debated each other, constantly. One senator would deliver a brilliant speech, another would immediately explain why it wasn't actually brilliant at all. A third would remind everyone about that embarrassing incident from 15 years earlier. Roman memories were astonishingly selective. They forgot taxes. They never forgot humiliation. Public criticism became an accepted weapon. Politicians mocked one another during speeches. Satirical poems spread through the city. Anonymous insults appeared as graffiti on walls. Rivals whispered rumours into the right ears, knowing that one well-placed story could do more damage than a dozen public arguments. Character assassination existed long before the phrase did, and it was considerably cheaper than building an army. Even successful military commanders faced enormous risks. Winning too many victories could make soldiers adore you more than the Republic itself. That sounded flattering until nervous politicians started wondering whether your popularity might become inconvenient. Julius Caesar learned that lesson rather dramatically. His military genius, generosity, and carefully cultivated image made him the most famous man in Rome. Citizens admired him. Soldiers adored him. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared. His influence eventually became so enormous that many senators feared one man was becoming larger than the Republic itself. The result was history's most infamous Senate meeting. Not every famous Roman met such a dramatic end, of course. Some were exiled. Others faded from public life after scandals, failed political careers, or unfortunate decisions. A few simply discovered that yesterday's hero could become tomorrow's forgotten name with surprising speed. Because influence is powerful, but it's also fragile. The same crowd that celebrates you today may find someone more exciting tomorrow. The Romans understood this better than anyone. Fame could lift you higher than you ever imagined. It could also make you the easiest person in the empire to find. If Julius Caesar understood how to build a powerful personal brand, and Augustus knew how to manage one, Nero showed what happens when you become a little too obsessed with your own publicity. Actually, a little might be generous. Imagine becoming so convinced that you're the greatest singer, actor, musician, athlete and performer alive that you insist an entire empire agrees with you, whether they want to or not. That was Nero. When Nero became emperor in the year 54 after Christ, he was only 16 years old. At first, things went surprisingly well. Guided by experienced advisors, the young emperor appeared promising. Taxes remained reasonable, public administration functioned effectively, and many Romans believed the empire had entered another stable reign. Then Nero discovered something he enjoyed even more than governing. Being admired, not respected. Admired. There is a difference. Respect usually comes from competence. Admiration can sometimes be achieved simply by making enough noise. Nero desperately wanted to be remembered as an artist. He wrote poetry, played the lyre, acted on stage, competed in musical contests, and sang before enormous audiences. None of these hobbies would have been particularly unusual for an ordinary Roman. For an emperor, however, they raised more than a few eyebrows. Roman aristocrats generally believed public performance was beneath someone of high status. Actors and entertainers could become famous, certainly, but emperors were expected to rule the empire, not headline the evening's entertainment. Nero disagreed. Spectacularly. Whenever he performed, audiences were expected to stay until the very end. Ancient writers claimed that leaving early was forbidden. Some supposedly pretended to faint just to be carried outside. Others reportedly climbed over walls to escape. Imagine a concert so long that your best exit strategy involves feigning unconsciousness. Modern encores suddenly seem much less intimidating. Winning competitions also became remarkably easy. Mostly because the judges understood that awarding second place to the emperor was not an especially healthy career choice. Strangely enough, Nero accumulated an impressive collection of victories. History remains unconvinced. His image appeared everywhere. Coins carried his portrait. Statues filled public spaces. Grand building projects celebrated his reign. After the Great Fire of Rome, he constructed the magnificent Golden House, an enormous palace decorated with marble, gold, artificial lakes, and extravagant gardens. It certainly attracted attention. Unfortunately, not always the kind he wanted. The more Nero tried to control how people saw him, the harder it became to separate image from reality. Rumours spread. Criticism grew. His carefully crafted public persona began cracking under the weight of his own ambition. Because influence has one unavoidable rule. You can encourage admiration. You cannot force it. The moment applause becomes mandatory, it stops being applause. It's simply very enthusiastic obedience. And no personal brand, whether in ancient Rome or today, can survive forever once people stop believing the performance. By now you've probably noticed a pattern. Romans didn't chase influence simply because it felt good, although it certainly didn't hurt. They chased influence because influence made everything else easier. Money, power, business, marriage, politics. The more people trusted your name, the less work your name had to do. Think about it this way. Imagine two merchants arrive in Rome selling identical olive oil. The first is completely unknown. The second has spent years sponsoring festivals, donating money to public projects, making speeches in the forum, and earning a reputation for honesty. Whose olive oil would you buy? Exactly. The product hasn't changed. The reputation has. Romans understood something modern economists still recognize today. Trust has value. Once people believed in you, opportunities seemed to appear almost effortlessly. Businessmen attracted more customers, lawyers found more clients, teachers filled their classrooms, doctors gained more patients. Architects received larger commissions. Even bankers preferred lending money to someone with an excellent public reputation. Your name became a guarantee, or at least a very persuasive sales pitch. Politicians benefited even more. A candidate with a respected family, military achievements, generous public donations, and an impressive speaking voice entered elections with an enormous advantage. Citizens naturally assumed that someone famous must also be capable. History has occasionally demonstrated that this assumption deserves careful testing. Military commanders also relied on influence. Soldiers fought harder for generals they admired. Victorious commanders gained loyal veterans who followed them for years, sometimes decades. Success on the battlefield produced fame, and fame attracted even greater loyalty. It became a remarkably efficient cycle. Win battles, gain followers, win more battles. Try not to alarm the Senate too much. Admittedly, that last step proved difficult for several ambitious Romans. Influence also shaped family fortunes. Prestigious marriages often connected powerful households together. Parents proudly advertised successful relatives. Family names became valuable assets passed from one generation to the next. If your grandfather had saved Rome, people remembered. If your uncle had embarrassed himself at an important banquet, people remembered that too. Nothing ever truly disappeared. The wealthy invested enormous sums protecting their public image because they understood it produced measurable returns. They funded temples, sponsored games, restored roads, supported artists, financed public buildings, and occasionally forgave debts. These actions certainly improved the city. They also happened to improve the donor's popularity. Funny how often those two goals manage to cooperate. Modern companies spend billions building recognizable brands. Celebrities carefully manage their public image. Businesses hire marketing teams, public relations experts, and communication specialists whose entire careers revolve around influencing public perception. The Romans accomplished much the same thing with speeches, monuments, festivals, generosity, and relentless visibility. They didn't invent marketing departments. They simply became one. And perhaps that's the biggest lesson Rome leaves behind. Attention was never the final prize. Attention was the investment. The real reward came from everything influence quietly unlocked afterward. By now, you've probably realized something slightly unsettling. The Romans were supposed to feel ancient. Instead, they keep feeling familiar. Change the marble streets into sidewalks. Replace togas with tailored suits. Swap wax tablets for smartphones. And suddenly, the distance between ancient Rome and today becomes surprisingly small. The technology changed. Human nature hardly did. The Romans understood that attention creates opportunity. They knew that people are naturally drawn to confidence, success, beauty, spectacle, and a good story. They recognized that the person who controlled the narrative often controlled the outcome. Sound familiar? Today, influencers carefully choose what parts of their lives to share. Romans did exactly the same thing. Julius Caesar wrote about his greatest victories. He didn't spend nearly as much time discussing the days everything went terribly wrong. Augustus proudly displayed magnificent temples and peaceful cities. He was noticeably less enthusiastic about reminding people how many civil wars had made his peaceful empire possible. Nero preferred audiences to remember his performances. History had other ideas. The principle hasn't changed. Most people naturally present the version of themselves they'd like the world to see. Nobody rushes to announce, "Good morning, everyone. I made 3 terrible decisions before breakfast." Some thoughts remain private, probably for the best. Even followers worked in remarkably similar ways. Modern creators measure subscribers. Roman politicians measured loyal clients. Influencers build communities. Roman patrons built networks. Today, recommendations travel through algorithms. Back then, they travelled through conversations in bathhouses, taverns, markets, and the forum. Different roads, same destination. Even public outrage feels strangely timeless. A scandal erupts. Everyone talks about it. Experts suddenly appear everywhere. People confidently explain complicated events despite learning about them approximately 6 minutes earlier. Then, a week later, everyone has moved on to the next exciting story. The Romans would have adapted to social media with alarming speed. One can almost picture Cicero posting lengthy political arguments before sunrise, carefully responding to critics throughout the afternoon, and ending the evening by reminding everyone they had misunderstood his previous statement. Caesar would almost certainly post dramatic updates from military campaigns. Augustus would hire the finest photographers in the empire, assuming someone first invented photography. Nero would probably live-stream concerts lasting 6 uninterrupted hours. Comments would be disabled, of course. The real lesson isn't that the Romans predicted the internet. They didn't. What they understood was something much deeper. People crave recognition. They seek admiration. They tell stories about themselves. They compare their lives with others. They chase status, belonging, influence, and the comforting feeling that someone, somewhere, is paying attention. Those desires helped build the Roman Empire. They still shape the modern world. So perhaps ancient Rome didn't invent influencers in the literal sense, but it certainly invented many of the rules they still follow today. And after 2,000 years, one final truth remains wonderfully unchanged. Whether you're speaking in the Roman Forum or posting online, people may forget exactly what you said, but they'll almost always remember how you made them feel, which it turns out has always been the most powerful kind of influence. Imagine opening your eyes before sunrise, not because of an alarm clock, but because the rooster, your aching back, and the cold air sneaking through the cracks in your cottage have all decided that sleeping is now an unnecessary luxury. You are not waking up refreshed. You are waking up already behind. That was the reality for most people living in medieval Europe. Stress was not an occasional visitor. It was more like a roommate who refused to pay rent and insisted on commenting on every decision you made. Unlike today, there was no weekend to anticipate, no paid holiday, and certainly no concept of taking a mental health day. If you stayed in bed because you simply felt overwhelmed, the wheat would not harvest itself, the cow would not milk itself, and your Lord would not send a thoughtful note saying, "Take all the time you need." Instead, life demanded action from the moment daylight appeared. Most medieval people lived in farming communities, and nearly every hour of the day revolved around keeping themselves alive until the next season. The year was divided not by holidays or vacations, but by planting, weeding, harvesting, repairing fences, collecting firewood, tending animals, preserving food, and praying that none of those jobs went disastrously wrong. The pressure began early in life. Children were expected to help as soon as they were physically able. A small child might gather eggs, scare birds away from crops, carry water, or watch younger siblings while adults worked the fields. By modern standards, childhood was remarkably short. Survival simply did not leave much room for it. Even before breakfast, your mind would already be full of questions. Did it rain too much overnight? Did wolves attack the sheep? Is the ox still healthy enough to pull the plough? Has your grain begun to rot? Is someone in the family showing signs of illness? Every one of those questions carried serious consequences. There was also very little separation between work and home. Your workplace was your home. Your livestock lived beside you. Your tools leaned against your walls. Every unfinished chore remained in sight, quietly reminding you that tomorrow's workload was already growing. Perhaps the greatest difference between medieval stress and modern stress was uncertainty. Today, many people worry about paying next month's bills. A medieval peasant often worried whether there would even be enough food to reach next month. There were no weather forecasts, no crop insurance, no government relief programs, and no supermarket stocked with food from across the world. If hail destroyed your barley, no truck would arrive carrying replacement grain. If disease killed your pigs, there was no compensation waiting. Nature had made its decision, and everyone simply had to live with it. This constant uncertainty shaped how medieval people viewed the world. Every clear sky was appreciated. Every healthy child was celebrated. Every successful harvest felt less like an achievement and more like escaping disaster for one more year. Because in medieval life, you were never really trying to become wealthy. Most days, you were simply trying not to lose everything. If waking up already behind was stressful, stepping outside made things even worse. The moment you looked across your fields, you were reminded that your entire future rested on forces you could neither predict nor control. Modern farmers have weather satellites, irrigation systems, fertilizers, and machines capable of harvesting acres in hours. Medieval farmers had none of those advantages. They had experience, hard work, and a hopeful glance toward the sky. Unfortunately, the weather had absolutely no interest in rewarding optimism. A single week of heavy rain could waterlog freshly planted crops. A late frost in spring could kill delicate shoots that had taken months of preparation to sow. Summer droughts baked the soil until it cracked open, while autumn storms flattened grain just days before harvest. Every season carried its own unique opportunity for disaster. You did not simply farm the land, you negotiated with it every single day. Most peasants depended on a handful of staple crops, such as wheat, barley, oats, or rye. If these failed, there was rarely a backup plan. Fields were carefully divided into strips, and although crop rotation helped preserve fertility, yields remained modest. On average, every seed planted produced only a few more in return, leaving very little margin for error. Then came the weeds. Without chemical herbicides or modern equipment, weeds were pulled by hand, one stubborn plant at a time. Entire families spent long days bent over fields, removing anything that threatened the precious grain. By evening, aching muscles were simply accepted as part of life. The animals brought their own worries. Oxen, horses, and cows were not merely livestock, they were valuable co-workers. If an ox became lame during ploughing season, replacing it could be impossible. Losing one animal might delay planting long enough to reduce the entire harvest. And then there were the pests. Mice raided granaries, birds descended on ripening fields, insects devoured crops with astonishing speed. Wild boars could trample carefully tended farmland overnight, while wandering deer helped themselves without so much as an apology. Even a flock of hungry geese could undo weeks of patient work. The harvest itself was perhaps the most stressful time of all. Every available hand joined the effort. Men swung sickles from dawn until dusk. Women gathered bundles into sheaves. Children collected loose stalks left behind. There was no room for delays because rain arriving at the wrong moment could ruin grain that had not yet been stored. When the final wagon finally rolled into the village, relief was never guaranteed. The grain still had to survive mould, fire, rats, theft, and a long winter that always seemed determined to last just a little longer than expected. In medieval life, finishing the harvest did not mean your worries were over. It simply meant you had survived one battle, while the next one was already waiting. Even if the weather had been kind and your crops were growing nicely, you were far from free. Medieval life came with another relentless source of stress that no amount of hard work could escape. Everyone seemed to want a piece of what you produced. The Lord expected his rent. The church expected its tithe. The king's officials might arrive demanding taxes. Local millers charged fees to grind your grain. Blacksmiths needed payment for repairing tools. If you borrowed seed or livestock from a neighbour, that debt also had to be repaid. Your harvest often belonged to several different people before your own family even tasted it. Most peasants were tenants rather than owners of the land they farmed. The fields technically belonged to a local noble, and in exchange for the right to work them, peasants owed labour, produce, rent, or a combination of all three. Depending on where and when they lived, they might spend several days each week working directly on the Lord's own fields before returning to their own. Imagine spending Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday helping someone else's farm, while desperately hoping your own crops could politely wait until Thursday. The church also played a central role in daily life. A common obligation was the tithe, usually around 1/10 of certain agricultural produce. Grain, lambs, chickens, eggs and other goods might all contribute. Most people accepted this as both a religious duty and a normal part of society. But when harvests were poor, giving away a portion of already limited food was hardly comforting. Then there were the countless smaller obligations that quietly emptied whatever remained. Need flour? You usually had to use the Lord's mill and pay for the privilege. Want to bake bread? In many places you paid to use the communal oven. Pressing grapes or apples could involve additional fees as well. Medieval life had a remarkable talent for inventing charges before the concept of customer service existed. Marriage brought responsibilities. Raising children meant more mouths to feed. Elderly relatives often depended on younger family members because there was no pension waiting after decades of labour. Every generation relied heavily upon the next. Occasionally, royal demands made matters even worse. Wars had to be financed, castles repaired, roads maintained, and extraordinary taxes could appear with little warning. News that the king required additional revenue rarely caused celebration in the village. Social expectations added another layer of pressure. Neighbours watched each other closely. Missing church without good reason attracted attention. Ignoring communal duties could damage your reputation. During harvest, refusing to help one another was remembered long after the grain had been stored. Your place in the community mattered, because one day you might desperately need that community in return. So while medieval people certainly feared famine and bad weather, they also carried another burden that never seemed to grow lighter. No matter how hard you worked, someone was always waiting for their share. As exhausting as work could be, medieval people understood that the greatest threat to their lives often arrived without warning. You could survive a difficult harvest, pay your dues, and finally have enough food stored for winter, only for one fever to undo months of relentless effort. Disease did not ask whether you had planned for it. A simple cut from a sickle while harvesting grain might become infected. A cough that seemed harmless on Monday could leave someone bedridden by Friday. An ordinary toothache could spread into a life-threatening infection because there were no antibiotics, no painkillers beyond herbal remedies, and certainly no quick trip to the local pharmacy. Your body was constantly one accident away from disaster. Even minor illnesses carried enormous consequences, because every member of the household had a job to do. If the father became too sick to plough, the fields waited for no one. If the mother could no longer bake bread, milk the animals, or prepare meals, the entire rhythm of the household began to collapse. Older children worked even harder, while younger ones often took on responsibilities far beyond their years. Nobody could simply call in sick. Medical knowledge existed, and medieval physicians were often more educated than popular myths suggest, but access was limited. Most ordinary villagers relied first on local healers, wise women, monks, or family traditions. Herbal remedies made from willow bark, sage, garlic, honey, or yarrow could sometimes ease symptoms, and surprisingly, a few of these treatments had genuine medicinal value. Others, however, were based more on hope than evidence. Religion also shaped how people understood illness. Many believed sickness could be connected to God's will, personal sin, or the mysterious balance of the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments often aimed to restore this balance through diet, herbs, bloodletting, or purging. While some patients recovered naturally, others endured treatments that probably made an already miserable day even less enjoyable. Hospitals did exist, but they looked very different from modern ones. Most were attached to monasteries or religious foundations and focused as much on providing shelter and spiritual comfort as on curing disease. Serious surgery was rare, dangerous, and usually considered a last resort. If you saw someone preparing knives, you hoped they were about to carve dinner. Then came the epidemics. Long before the Black Death devastated Europe in the 14th century, villages regularly faced outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, influenza, measles, and other infectious diseases. Poor sanitation, contaminated water, and close living quarters allowed illness to spread quickly from one household to another. The hardest part was the uncertainty. One week your village could be busy preparing for harvest. The next, church bells might ring not for celebration, but for another funeral. Families who had worried about the weather only days earlier suddenly found themselves praying for something far more precious than a successful crop. In medieval life, good health was never something people assumed they would have tomorrow. It was simply another blessing they hoped would last one more day. Even on the warmest day of summer, winter was already waiting. That may sound dramatic, but for a medieval family, nearly every decision made between spring and autumn was really about surviving the cold months ahead. Winter was not simply another season. It was an examination that lasted for months, and no one knew exactly what questions it would ask. Every sack of grain stored in the barn represented future meals. Every log chopped in the forest meant another night beside the fire. Every piece of salted meat hanging from the rafters was a small victory against hunger. Unfortunately, Winter had an annoying habit of lasting longer than supplies did. Unlike modern households, medieval families could not visit a supermarket if food ran low. Everything had to be grown, gathered, hunted or preserved months in advance. Meat was salted or smoked, vegetables were dried, cheese was carefully stored. Ale was brewed because clean drinking water was not always reliable, and fermented beverages were often safer than untreated water. Preserving food became almost as important as producing it. A single mistake could be disastrous. If dampness reached stored grain, mould might spread through the entire supply. If rats found their way into the granary, they did not politely nibble one corner before leaving. They invited the entire extended family. Fires, another constant danger, could destroy months of preparation in a matter of hours. Every strange smell inside the storage room became a reason to worry. Fuel created another source of endless pressure. Firewood had to be gathered, cut, stacked, and kept dry before winter arrived. Families often spent countless hours collecting fallen branches or cutting timber where they were legally allowed to do so. A harsh winter consumed enormous quantities of wood, and running out meant far more than feeling uncomfortable. Without enough fuel, homes became dangerously cold, meals became difficult to cook, and illness spread more easily among weakened bodies. Livestock also needed protection. Animals required hay collected during summer, sheltered spaces away from freezing winds, and constant attention. Losing a cow or an ox during winter was not simply the loss of an animal. It could mean losing milk, future calves, or the very strength needed to plough fields once spring returned. Then there was the snow itself. Heavy snowfall could isolate entire villages for weeks. Roads disappeared beneath ice and mud. Merchants stopped arriving. News travelled slowly, if at all. If a family exhausted its supplies before the thaw, help was unlikely to appear from beyond the next hill. Perhaps that explains why medieval people celebrated the arrival of spring with such genuine joy. It was not merely the end of cold weather. It was proof that they had survived another winter, something that every single year could never be taken for granted. Even if your family was healthy, your food stores were full, and the weather had finally decided to cooperate for once, there was one source of stress that remained completely outside your control: the world beyond your village. Most medieval people rarely travelled far from home. Some spent their entire lives within a few miles of the place where they were born. Yet distant events had an extraordinary ability to arrive at their doorstep, usually bringing trouble rather than opportunity. When strangers rode into the village in a hurry, people did not gather expecting wonderful surprises. They expected bad news. Perhaps a neighbouring lord had declared war. Maybe raiders had been spotted along the nearby roads. A noble family could be feuding over land, and suddenly every peasant found themselves caught in the middle. Medieval politics had a remarkable way of involving people who had absolutely no say in them. Imagine spending months carefully growing wheat, only to watch an army march straight through your fields, because your village happened to be located between two castles. Soldiers rarely travelled lightly. Hundreds or even thousands of men required enormous amounts of food. Grain disappeared from barns. Chickens vanished from farmyards. Sheep became tomorrow's dinner. Horses consumed valuable hay that had been intended for winter. The army usually continued its journey. The villagers stayed behind to deal with what was left. Even when armies behaved with discipline, simply passing nearby created anxiety. Families hid valuables beneath floorboards or inside walls. Livestock might be driven into nearby forests in hopes they would escape being seized. Mothers kept children close, while fathers nervously watched unfamiliar banners approaching along dusty roads. War also disrupted trade. If merchants avoided dangerous routes, Villages lost access to iron tools, salt, cloth, and countless other goods they could not produce themselves. Salt was especially valuable because it preserved meat. Without it, food spoiled far more quickly. A conflict taking place dozens of miles away could quietly make winter much harder for people who had never even seen a battlefield. Then there were the rumours. Without newspapers, radios, or reliable communication, information spread by travellers, merchants, pilgrims, and wandering monks. Every story changed slightly with each retelling. One traveller claimed an entire town had burned. Another insisted the king had died. Someone else swore that bandits now controlled the next valley. Separating truth from exaggeration was nearly impossible. Yet people still had to make decisions based on these stories. Should they travel to market? Was it safe to visit relatives? Should they delay the harvest because soldiers might arrive? Nobody knew for certain. Living in the medieval world often meant preparing for disasters that might never happen, while hoping the ones you failed to imagine stayed far away. Sometimes they did. Far too often they did not. After hearing about endless work, uncertain harvests, illness, taxes, and the constant threat of war, you might assume medieval people eagerly looked forward to moments of peace. They certainly did. The problem was finding enough of them. The image of medieval peasants working every single hour of every single day is actually an exaggeration. The church calendar included many feast days, saints' days, and religious festivals when ordinary labour slowed or stopped. Weddings, fairs, market days, and seasonal celebrations also broke up the routine. These occasions mattered deeply because they offered rare opportunities to laugh, dance, tell stories, and forget tomorrow's worries. But even during celebrations, responsibility never completely disappeared. Someone still had to feed the animals before joining the festivities. Fires still needed tending. Bread still had to be baked. Infants did not conveniently postpone crying because today happened to honour a particular saint. The rhythm of survival never paused for very long. When evening finally arrived after a full day's work, people often gathered around the hearth rather than collapsing immediately into bed. The fireplace was more than a source of warmth. It became the centre of family life. Meals were shared, clothing was repaired, tools were mended, and stories were passed from one generation to the next. Those evenings could be comforting. They could also be surprisingly busy. A torn tunic needed stitching before tomorrow's work. Fishing nets required repair. Baskets had to be woven. Grain might need grinding for the following morning. Candle making, spinning wool, and carving wooden tools often continued long after the fields had disappeared into darkness. In many homes, daylight was spent earning tomorrow's meal, while evening was spent preparing for the next day's labour. Sleep itself was not always peaceful. Many families shared a single room with children, grandparents, and sometimes even small animals sheltered indoors during cold weather. Privacy was almost non-existent. A crying baby, a barking dog, a restless cow in the adjoining space, or a sudden storm rattling the roof could interrupt what little sleep people managed to get. Winter nights were long and cold. Summer mornings arrived early. Either way, the rooster remained stubbornly committed to starting the day before anyone felt ready. Even emotionally, true relaxation was difficult. Parents worried about children. Children worried about aging parents. A poor harvest lingered in everyone's thoughts long after the grain had been gathered. If one problem disappeared, another usually arrived before anyone had time to enjoy the victory. Yet this makes medieval celebrations all the more remarkable. When music echoed through the village square, when neighbours danced around bonfires, when ale flowed freely after a successful harvest, people embraced those moments with extraordinary enthusiasm. Not because life was easy, but because they understood better than anyone that joy was precious precisely because it never lasted forever. After everything medieval people faced, you might wonder why they bothered planning for the future at all. The answer is surprisingly simple. Because giving up was never really an option. Most families lived from one season to the next, always aware that a single disaster could erase years of hard work. Yet every spring they planted again. Every autumn they harvested again. Every winter they repaired their homes, sharpened their tools, and quietly prepared to begin the entire cycle once more. Resilience was not something medieval people talked about. It was simply how they survived. Faith played a tremendous role in helping people cope with uncertainty. The church stood at the centre of village life, not only as a religious institution, but also as a place where communities gathered, celebrated births, mourned deaths, and sought comfort during difficult times. Whether facing famine, disease, or personal tragedy, many people believed their suffering had meaning within a larger divine plan. That belief did not remove hardship, but it often made hardship easier to endure. Pilgrimages became another source of hope. Some people travelled great distances to visit holy shrines, asking for healing, forgiveness, or simply better fortune. These journeys were rarely comfortable. Roads were rough, inns were unreliable, and bandits remained a genuine concern. Yet thousands still made the trip because hope itself was worth the effort. Communities also depended heavily upon one another. When a family's house burned down, neighbours often helped rebuild it. During harvest, entire villages worked together to bring in crops before storms arrived. If someone became too ill to work, relatives and friends might temporarily take over essential tasks. Medieval society could certainly be harsh, but it was also deeply interconnected. Isolation was dangerous, while cooperation often meant survival. There were moments of genuine happiness as well. A child taking their first steps, a successful harvest after months of anxiety, a wedding that brought two families together, the birth of healthy livestock in spring, the ringing of church bells on a festival morning. These moments carried enormous emotional weight because everyone understood how fragile good fortune could be. Perhaps that is why medieval humour could be surprisingly lively. People joked during harvests, laughed at village festivals, played games in taverns, sang around fires, and delighted in practical jokes. After all, if your roof leaked, your boots had holes, and tomorrow's weather might ruin everything, you could either cry or laugh. Many wisely chose the second option. Looking back across the centuries, it is easy to see only the hardships. But medieval people saw something different. They saw another sunrise, another chance to keep their families fed, another opportunity to improve a field, repair a fence, celebrate with neighbours, or simply make it through one more day. Sometimes that was enough to keep going. And in a world filled with uncertainty, hope became one of the most valuable possessions anyone could have. If you were invited to an ancient Greek dinner and expected mountains of roasted meat, overflowing goblets of exotic sauces, and enough desserts to impress a modern buffet, you would probably leave wondering if the main course had accidentally been forgotten. Instead, someone would hand you a loaf of fresh bread, a bowl of olives, a small dish of fragrant olive oil, perhaps a little cheese, and smile as though they had just presented the finest meal imaginable. In many ways, they had. The foundation of ancient Greek cooking was never about complexity. It was about making ordinary ingredients taste extraordinary. More than 2,000 years later, that philosophy still shapes kitchens across the Mediterranean. Everything began with bread. Bread was eaten every day by nearly everyone, from wealthy Athenians discussing philosophy beneath painted colonnades to farmers returning from long hours in the fields. Wheat bread was prized when available, but barley bread was even more common because barley grew well in Greece's rocky, dry landscape. Every household depended on it. Without bread, a meal felt incomplete. Then came olive oil. To call olive oil a simple cooking ingredient would be like calling the Parthenon a nice little building. Olive oil was everywhere. It flavoured food, preserved ingredients, fueled lamps, softened skin, and even played a role in religious ceremonies and athletic competitions. Olive trees could produce fruit for generations, making them one of a family's most valuable possessions. The Greeks treated good olive oil with enormous respect. Fortunately for us, they also happened to be completely right. Next came olives themselves. Green or black, cured in brine or packed with herbs, olives appeared on tables throughout the Greek world. They required very little preparation, yet offered healthy fats, rich flavour, and excellent keeping qualities. A bowl of olives alongside fresh bread could easily become an entire meal for an ordinary labourer. Herbs completed the picture. Oregano, thyme, mint, dill, coriander, fennel, and parsley grew naturally across much of Greece. Instead of covering food with heavy sauces, Greek cooks relied on fresh herbs to bring brightness and aroma. Their goal was not to hide the flavour of the ingredients, but to celebrate them. Perhaps the biggest surprise is just how familiar this meal still feels. Walk into a Greek taverna today, and before you've even opened the menu, you're likely to receive crusty bread, olive oil, olives, and perhaps a little cheese to share. The faces around the table have changed, the language has evolved, and electric lights have replaced oil lamps. But the meal itself remains astonishingly recognisable. It is one of history's quietest culinary miracles. Empires have risen and fallen. Philosophers have come and gone. Entire civilizations have disappeared. Yet somewhere, someone is still tearing off a piece of warm bread, dipping it into olive oil, adding an olive on the side, and unknowingly enjoying almost the exact same flavours that an ancient Greek would have recognised more than 2,000 years ago. If bread was the foundation of every ancient Greek meal, then one particular kind of bread quietly ruled the table for centuries. Its name was masa, and despite sounding like the latest artisan bakery trend, it was actually one of the oldest staple foods in European history. Today, most people associate bread with wheat. Soft sandwich loaves, crusty baguettes, fluffy dinner rolls, they all begin with wheat flour. But in ancient Greece, barley often took centre stage. There was a practical reason for this. Much of Greece is rocky, mountainous, and dry. Wheat prefers richer soil and more predictable rainfall. Barley, on the other hand, is remarkably stubborn. It tolerates poorer ground, survives drier conditions, and matures more quickly. In other words, it was perfectly suited to a land where farming was rarely easy. For generations, barley became the grain that kept ordinary people alive. Masa was usually made by grinding roasted or dried barley into flour. Depending on the region and the family's wealth, the flour could be mixed with water, olive oil, or sometimes a little wine before being shaped into flat cakes or coarse loaves. Some versions were baked on hot stones, while others were cooked on simple clay ovens. There were even preparations that required little or no baking at all, with the barley meal simply moistened and eaten as a dense paste. It probably wasn't winning many beauty contests, but it was filling, inexpensive, and dependable, qualities that mattered far more than appearance. Ancient writers mentioned masa so often that it almost fades into the background of their works. Philosophers discussed it. Soldiers marched with it. Farmers carried it into the fields. Sailors packed it for long voyages because barley kept well and could be prepared with minimal equipment. It was, quite literally, everyday food. That did not mean it had to be boring, A drizzle of fresh olive oil immediately transformed its flavour. Crumbled goat's cheese added richness. Wild thyme, oregano, sesame seeds, or crushed coriander provided aroma. A spoonful of honey could turn a simple barley cake into something worthy of a festival rather than an ordinary afternoon. Modern cooks can recreate a surprisingly authentic version with little effort. Mix barley flour with a little wheat flour to help the dough hold together. Add warm water, olive oil, a pinch of salt, and perhaps a scattering of dried herbs. Bake it until the crust becomes lightly golden, then serve it warm with olives and fresh cheese. The result may not look particularly impressive, but the first bite explains why this humble bread-fed philosophers debating democracy, athletes training for the Olympic Games, merchants crossing the Aegean, and countless families gathered around simple wooden tables. Sometimes history's greatest recipes are not the most elaborate. They are the ones that quietly nourish entire civilizations for centuries. If there were an official comfort food of ancient Greece, lentil soup would have been a serious contender. It did not require expensive ingredients. It did not demand the skills of a master cook. It certainly did not impress wealthy dinner guests looking for culinary extravagance. What it did was keep people alive. Known as fake, lentil soup appeared on Greek tables for centuries and became one of the most common meals eaten throughout the ancient world. Rich merchants enjoyed it, farmers relied on it, soldiers appreciated its simplicity, and even famous philosophers occasionally mentioned it as the perfect example of a modest, satisfying meal. Lentils were ideal for Greek farmers. Unlike some crops, they grew well in the Mediterranean climate, enriched the soil by fixing nitrogen, and stored remarkably well after harvest. Once dried, they could last for months, making them invaluable during winter or times of poor harvest. Every household tried to keep a supply tucked away because lentils were reliable when other foods became scarce. Reliability was perhaps their greatest luxury. Preparing the soup was refreshingly uncomplicated. The lentils were first rinsed to remove stones and dust before being simmered slowly in water. Into the pot went onions, garlic, and sometimes leeks, if they were available. A generous splash of olive oil enriched the broth, while herbs such as oregano, thyme, bay leaves, or coriander added fragrance without overwhelming the earthy flavour of the lentils. There was one ingredient, however, that often surprises modern cooks: vinegar. Rather than squeezing a lemon into the finished soup, many ancient Greeks added a small amount of wine vinegar. Lemons would not become common in Greece until many centuries later, so vinegar supplied the pleasant sharpness that balanced the richness of the olive oil. It gave the soup a bright, slightly tangy finish that modern diners often find surprisingly familiar. Some families also added carrots, celery, or wild greens depending on the season, although the exact ingredients naturally varied from one region to another. Like every truly great traditional recipe, it adapted to whatever happened to be growing nearby. There was nothing glamorous about lentil soup. In fact, comic playwrights occasionally joked about it because it was considered such an ordinary meal. If someone served lentils again, nobody gasped in amazement. They simply reached for another piece of bread. Yet that simplicity was exactly the point. Today, you can recreate an authentic version with dried lentils, onions, garlic, olive oil, bay leaves, oregano, and a splash of red wine vinegar just before serving. Pair it with rustic bread and a few olives, and you are remarkably close to a meal that would have been instantly recognizable in Athens more than 2,000 years ago. It is warm, nourishing, inexpensive, and deeply satisfying, which may explain why one of the oldest recipes in European history still feels perfectly at home on a modern dinner table. If lentil soup showed the practical side of ancient Greek cooking, the next dish revealed something equally important. The Greeks knew exactly how to treat themselves. Not with towering cakes or mountains of chocolate, of course. Cocoa had not yet crossed the Atlantic, and sugar was still many centuries away. Instead, one of the simplest pleasures in ancient Greece consisted of fresh cheese, fragrant honey, aromatic herbs, and a handful of nuts. 4 humble ingredients. Together, they created a dish that still appears on Greek tables today. Cheese was one of the most valuable foods in the Greek world. Sheep and goats thrived on Greece's rocky hillsides far better than cattle, so their milk became the foundation of the country's dairy production. Fresh cheeses were especially common because they required relatively little aging and could be prepared by ordinary households. The result was soft, creamy, and pleasantly tangy. While modern feta is probably the cheese most people associate with Greece, the cheeses eaten in classical Athens were often milder and closer to today's fresh goat cheese or young sheep's cheese. They were spread onto bread, crumbled over vegetables, or simply eaten on their own. Then came the honey. If olive oil was the king of Greek cooking, honey was undoubtedly its queen. Without refined sugar, honey provided nearly all the sweetness people enjoyed. Greek beekeeping was already highly developed, and the honey produced from wild thyme flowers became especially famous. Even today, thyme honey from Greece is considered among the finest in the Mediterranean. A drizzle transformed the cheese completely. The salty richness met warm floral sweetness, creating a balance that modern chefs still chase in expensive restaurants. The Greeks, meanwhile, had been quietly enjoying it for centuries. Fresh herbs elevated the dish even further. A sprinkle of thyme echoed the flavour of the honey. Mint added freshness. Oregano introduced an earthy aroma. Some families scattered crushed walnuts or almonds across the top, adding a satisfying crunch that contrasted beautifully with the soft cheese. It was elegant without trying to be. Perhaps that is why the recipe has survived for over 2,000 years. Making it today requires almost no effort. Place fresh goat cheese or sheep's cheese on a plate, drizzle generously with good quality honey, scatter chopped walnuts over the top, finish with a pinch of fresh thyme and a light splash of excellent olive oil if you're feeling particularly authentic. Serve it with warm, rustic bread. That is almost all there is to it. It may seem almost too simple to deserve attention, but simplicity was often the greatest strength of ancient Greek cuisine. Rather than burying ingredients beneath heavy sauces and elaborate techniques, Greek cooks trusted the natural flavours to do the work. And judging by the fact that millions of people still enjoy this exact combination today, it is difficult to argue with their results. Sometimes the recipes that survive the longest are not the most complicated. They are simply the ones that taste timeless. By now, a pattern is probably beginning to emerge. Ancient Greek recipes rarely relied on rare spices, complicated techniques, or ingredients that required an expedition worthy of Jason and the Argonauts. Instead, Greek cooks excelled at transforming ordinary plants into memorable meals. Perhaps no recipe demonstrates that better than stuffed grape leaves. Today, most people know them as dolmades, neatly rolled parcels filled with rice, herbs, and sometimes meat. They're served in tavernas from Athens to the islands, usually with lemon and olive oil, but the idea behind them is far older than the name itself. Long before the word dolma entered the region through later Turkish influence, Greeks and their neighbours were already wrapping fillings inside grape leaves. Vineyards covered much of the Greek countryside, producing not only wine, but an abundance of tender leaves every spring. Throwing those leaves away would have seemed almost absurd. Instead, cooks discovered they were remarkably useful. Young grape leaves are soft, flexible, and slightly tangy. After being briefly blanched in hot water, they become easy to fold around almost any filling while holding everything neatly together during cooking. The fillings depended largely on what a household could afford. For ordinary farming families, the centre usually consisted of barley or wheat groats mixed with onions, fresh herbs, and generous amounts of olive oil. Mint, dill, parsley, fennel, and coriander all grew naturally across Greece and found their way into the mixture. These herbs gave the parcels a freshness that balanced the richness of the oil. Wealthier households sometimes added minced lamb or goat, not because meat was expected, but because it was available. This surprises many modern readers. Contrary to popular imagination, ancient Greeks did not eat large portions of meat every day. Livestock represented wealth, milk, wool, labour, and future breeding animals. Slaughtering one was often reserved for religious festivals, sacrifices, or particularly important celebrations. That meant many stuffed grape leaves were entirely vegetarian, and they were delicious because of it. The finished rolls were arranged carefully inside a clay pot, drizzled generously with olive oil, covered with water or light broth, and cooked slowly until the grains became tender and the grape leaves absorbed every fragrant flavour inside. There was no rush. Like so much of ancient Greek cooking, patience was one of the ingredients. You can make an astonishingly authentic version today using grape leaves, short grain rice or barley, chopped onions, parsley, dill, mint, olive oil, and a pinch of salt. For historical accuracy, skip the lemon juice while cooking and use a splash of wine vinegar if you want a touch of acidity. Lemons would not become common in Greek cuisine until many centuries later. Take your first bite, and you'll notice something remarkable. Despite empires rising and falling, languages changing, and recipes evolving across generations, these little rolls still deliver the same fresh herbs, silky olive oil, and comforting simplicity that ancient Greek families would have recognized over 2,000 years ago. While barley bread filled the stomach and lentil soup warmed the body, there was one ingredient that truly connected the ancient Greeks to the sea: fish. Considering that much of Greece is surrounded by coastline and scattered across hundreds of islands, this probably comes as no surprise. The Aegean, Ionian, and Mediterranean seas supplied communities with an astonishing variety of seafood, making fish one of the most important sources of protein in the ancient world. For many Greeks, the sea was not just a highway, it was a pantry. Every morning, fishermen pushed small wooden boats into the water before sunrise. Some cast nets close to shore, while others lowered hooks or traps into deeper waters. Depending on the season, they returned with sea bream, mullet, sardines, mackerel, tuna, octopus, squid, or shellfish. Their catch often reached local markets only hours later. Freshness was everything. Without refrigeration, fish spoiled quickly, so coastal communities enjoyed it immediately. Inland towns, meanwhile, often relied on salted or dried fish, which could survive long journeys and remain edible for months. Once the fish reached the kitchen, the preparation was surprisingly restrained. Modern recipes often call for butter, cream, or elaborate marinades. Ancient Greek cooks would have considered most of that unnecessary. Good fish already possessed excellent flavour. Their job was simply not to ruin it. The fish was cleaned, lightly salted, brushed with generous amounts of olive oil, and cooked over glowing charcoal or an open fire. Clay grills and metal grates allowed excess fat to drip away while the skin became beautifully crisp. Then came the finishing touches. Fresh oregano was a favourite, along with thyme, dill, parsley, or fennel, depending on the region and season. Rather than squeezing lemon over the fish, which would have been historically inaccurate for classical Greece, cooks often added a splash of wine vinegar. The acidity brightened the rich olive oil while enhancing the natural sweetness of the fish, without overpowering it. Sometimes simplicity really is the greatest luxury. Even famous Greek writers praised seafood. Wealthier Athenians developed particular enthusiasm for expensive species like red mullet, occasionally paying astonishing sums for especially prized fish. Comic playwrights even poked fun at citizens who became obsessed with gourmet seafood, proving that food snobbery is considerably older than social media. Fortunately, you do not need the budget of an Athenian aristocrat to recreate this meal. Choose a whole sea bream, sea bass, trout, or any firm white fish. Brush it generously with extra virgin olive oil, season with sea salt, and grill until the flesh flakes easily. Finish with chopped oregano, fresh parsley, and just a splash of red or white wine vinegar. Serve it alongside warm barley bread and a handful of olives. With remarkably little effort, you will be enjoying a meal that would have felt perfectly at home on a Greek island more than 2,000 years ago, proving that some recipes never needed improving in the first place. After enjoying fresh bread, hearty soups, fragrant herbs, and perfectly grilled fish, you may be wondering whether the ancient Greeks ever rewarded themselves with dessert. The answer is yes, and surprisingly, one of their sweetest creations bears an uncanny resemblance to something you can still order in countless cafes today: cheesecake. Not the towering New York version with cream cheese and strawberry sauce, of course. Ancient Greek cheesecake was much simpler, lighter, and far older. Yet historians consider it one of the earliest recorded cheesecakes in history, with recipes dating back well over 2,000 years. Its origins may be even older than classical Greece itself. Archaeologists have found cheese-making equipment on the Greek mainland dating back thousands of years before Socrates ever asked uncomfortable philosophical questions. Once people learned how to make fresh cheese, turning it into a satisfying baked treat was almost inevitable. The Greeks called one version plakos, meaning flat cake. Rather than layers of sponge and frosting, it consisted of fresh cheese mixed with flour and sweetened with honey. Some recipes included eggs to bind the mixture, while others relied on the cheese itself to create a soft, dense texture. Once prepared, the cake was baked until lightly golden, before receiving another drizzle of honey over the top. Simple, elegant, remarkably modern. One ancient writer, Athenaeus, preserves references to cheesecakes served at banquets, while other historical sources suggest similar cakes were offered during religious festivals and celebrations. Perhaps the most famous tradition links cheesecake to the ancient Olympic Games. According to later accounts, athletes competing at Olympia were served cheesecakes before events as a source of nourishment and energy. Whether every competitor actually enjoyed them remains debated by historians, but the idea is certainly believable. Fresh cheese provided protein, flour supplied carbohydrates, and honey delivered a quick burst of energy. It was essentially an ancient sports snack, just with considerably fewer marketing slogans. Making an authentic version today is surprisingly straightforward. Mix fresh ricotta or soft goat cheese with a little wheat flour, 1 egg, and several generous spoonfuls of good quality honey. Some modern cooks also add a touch of thyme or a handful of sesame seeds, ingredients that would have felt perfectly at home in an ancient Greek kitchen. Bake until lightly browned, then drizzle with even more honey before serving. The result is nothing like the rich cheesecakes many people expect. It is lighter, less sweet, and allows the flavour of the cheese to remain at the centre of the dish. Every bite reflects the ancient Greek approach to cooking. Use excellent ingredients, interfere with them as little as possible, and trust nature to provide the flavour. Perhaps that is why this humble dessert has survived for millennia. Long before cafes displayed cheesecakes behind polished glass counters, Greek families were already gathering around simple wooden tables, slicing into warm, honey-sweetened cheesecakes, and proving that some of history's greatest desserts never needed excessive decoration to become unforgettable. If there was one ingredient that truly defined sweetness in ancient Greece, it was honey. Not because people preferred it over sugar, they simply had no alternative. Sugarcane existed in distant parts of Asia, but refined sugar would not become a familiar ingredient around the Mediterranean for many centuries. For the Greeks, nearly every sweet treat depended on the hard work of bees. Honey-flavoured cakes, sweetened wine, glazed fruits, accompanied cheese, and even found its way into medicines. It was one of the most treasured ingredients in the kitchen. Fortunately, Greek beekeepers had become exceptionally skilled at producing it. Hives were often placed near hillsides, covered in wild thyme, rosemary, and aromatic flowers. As a result, different regions produced honey with distinct flavours, much like modern wines, reflect the land where grapes are grown. Thyme honey became especially prized for its rich aroma and floral sweetness, earning admiration that continues to this day. With honey in abundance, cooks created desserts that were surprisingly simple. One of the oldest surviving examples combined toasted sesame seeds with warm honey. Once mixed together, the sticky mass was pressed into thin slabs and left to cool before being cut into pieces. The result resembled today's sesame brittle or energy bars, offering a satisfying crunch alongside natural sweetness. It was portable, nutritious, and lasted well during travel. Ancient hikers would probably have approved. Another favourite consisted of small fried cakes made from wheat flour and olive oil. Once golden and crisp, they were drenched generously in honey, and sometimes sprinkled with sesame seeds or crushed nuts. The outside remained lightly crisp while the inside stayed soft and tender. You can almost imagine someone reaching for a second one, while quietly insisting they were only checking if the first had been cooked properly. Fresh fruit also played an important role in Greek desserts. Figs, grapes, pomegranates, apples, and pears were often served after meals. Some were eaten fresh, while others were dried to preserve them through winter. Dried figs became especially valuable because they concentrated their natural sweetness and could be stored for months without spoiling. Walnuts and almonds frequently accompanied these fruits, creating combinations that modern nutritionists would probably describe as remarkably balanced. The Greeks simply described them as dinner. Recreating these ancient desserts today requires very little effort. Toast sesame seeds until fragrant, stir them into gently warmed honey, spread the mixture onto parchment paper, and allow it to cool before slicing. Or fry small rounds of simple dough in olive oil before finishing them with honey and chopped walnuts. The flavours are wonderfully familiar. There is no refined sugar, no artificial flavouring, no colourful frosting competing for attention. Instead, every ingredient contributes exactly what nature intended, and perhaps that is the greatest surprise of all. More than 2,000 years later, these humble honeycakes and sesame sweets do not feel like historical curiosities. They simply taste like desserts that never went out of style. After travelling through the kitchens of ancient Greece, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. As the first rays of sunlight begin to creep over the rocky hills of ancient Greece, an entire farming family is already awake. There are no alarm clocks. The goats provide enough noise for that. Inside a small stone house with a packed earth floor, the fire that burned through the night is carefully stirred back to life. Someone adds a few dry branches. Another reaches for yesterday's bread. Children rub sleep from their eyes while adults are already thinking about the work waiting beyond the doorway. The fields will not wait. Neither will the sheep, the vines, or the olive trees. Before anyone leaves for a long day of labour, the family gathers for breakfast. By modern standards, it is remarkably simple. By ancient Greek standards, it is exactly what is needed. The meal begins with bread. Usually, this is coarse barley bread rather than fine wheat bread. Barley thrived in Greece's dry, rocky soil, making it the grain most ordinary families relied upon. The loaf is dense, slightly nutty, and often baked every few days, meaning today's breakfast may involve bread that is no longer perfectly fresh. That is hardly a problem. A generous drizzle of olive oil brings it back to life. The oil itself is one of the household's greatest treasures. Every drop represents months of tending olive trees, harvesting fruit, and pressing the olives after the autumn harvest. Rather than using butter, which was uncommon in Greek cuisine, the family tears off pieces of bread and dips them directly into fragrant olive oil. Next comes a small bowl of olives, green or black, cured in brine for weeks. They provide both flavour and valuable nutrition. They are salty, filling, and easy to store for long periods. Nearly every farming household keeps a supply, because olives can accompany almost any meal throughout the year. Fresh goat's cheese often joins the table. The family's goats provide milk almost daily during the season, allowing simple cheeses to be made at home. Soft, slightly tangy, and rich in protein, the cheese pairs perfectly with bread and olives. Sometimes it is eaten plain. Other mornings, someone drizzles a little honey across the top if the household has been fortunate enough to collect some from nearby beehives. Fruit depends entirely on the season. In late summer, there may be fresh figs bursting with sweetness. During autumn, clusters of grapes appear beside the bread. In winter, dried figs saved from the previous harvest provide welcome energy before a long day's work. Apples, pears, and pomegranates also make appearances whenever nature decides they are ready. There is rarely anything wasteful about the meal. If lentil soup remained from the previous evening, it is gently reheated over the fire. Leftovers were not something to avoid, they were practical. A warm bowl of lentils offered slow-burning energy that could sustain hours of ploughing, pruning, harvesting, or repairing stone walls beneath the Mediterranean sun. To drink, the adults usually pour a little wine into their cups. But this is not the strong wine many people imagine. Greek wine was almost always diluted with water, often at a ratio of 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking unmixed wine was generally viewed as uncivilized, while diluted wine was considered healthier than untreated water in many places. Within a short time, breakfast is over. There are no lingering conversations around the table. The father shoulders his tools. Older children help drive goats toward the hillsides. The mother begins organising the day's countless household tasks before joining work outdoors herself. Even the youngest children quickly find small jobs they can manage. It is a modest meal, built from bread, olives, cheese, fruit, and olive oil. Yet these same simple foods have nourished Greek families for thousands of years, proving that sometimes the most ordinary breakfast is also one of history's most enduring. By the time the sun begins to sink behind the hills, the farming family finally returns home. Their hands are rough, their clothes smell of earth, their backs ache from bending over fields since dawn. If it is harvest season, everyone is exhausted. Men have spent the day swinging sickles through golden barley or wheat. Women have tied bundles into sheaves, gathered vegetables from the garden, or cared for the animals. Children have collected loose stalks, frightened birds away from the crops, or carried water under the hot Mediterranean sun. Now comes the most anticipated moment of the day: the evening meal. Unlike breakfast, which was quick and practical, dinner was usually the family's largest meal. It was the one time everyone could sit together, recover from the day's labour, and enjoy food while it was still warm. The fire burns steadily in the centre of the house. Suspended above it is a clay pot that has been simmering for hours. Inside is a thick stew. The exact ingredients change with the seasons, but lentils, chickpeas, broad beans, or split peas often form the base. Into the pot go onions, garlic, leeks, wild greens, and whatever herbs happen to be growing nearby. Oregano, thyme, dill, fennel, and parsley all contribute their unmistakable aroma. Finally, a generous stream of olive oil is poured in just before serving. The oil gives the stew richness without requiring expensive ingredients. Every family member receives a clay bowl filled nearly to the top. Beside it sits another thick slice of barley bread. The bread serves two purposes. It fills hungry stomachs, and it acts as the perfect utensil. Rather than wasting a drop of the flavourful broth, pieces of bread are dipped directly into the stew until every last spoonful has disappeared. Fresh vegetables accompany the meal whenever possible. Cucumbers, onions, cabbage, radishes, and leafy greens appear according to the season. They are often dressed with little more than olive oil, vinegar, and herbs. Simple ingredients, remarkable flavour. Protein depends largely on circumstance. Eggs occasionally appear when the hens have been productive. Goat's cheese is common, adding richness to an otherwise modest meal. Families living near rivers or the sea may grill fresh fish over charcoal, while those farther inland might enjoy salted fish preserved from previous market visits. Meat, however, remains surprisingly rare. Contrary to many modern assumptions, an ordinary farming family did not roast lamb every evening. Sheep and goats represented milk, wool, future offspring, and valuable wealth. Slaughtering one simply for dinner made little economic sense. Fresh meat was far more likely to appear during religious festivals, sacrifices, weddings, or important celebrations than on an ordinary Tuesday after weeding the barley field. To drink, everyone shares diluted wine or water. Children often receive more water than wine, while adults mix the two according to custom. Drinking wine without dilution was widely considered excessive, almost barbaric by Greek standards. As darkness settles over the countryside, conversation replaces labour. The family discusses tomorrow's work, the condition of the crops, neighbours' news, and whether rain might arrive before the next planting. Outside, the goats grow quiet, and the fields disappear into the evening shadows. The meal itself is humble, but after 12 hours of honest work, a warm bowl of stew, fresh bread, olive oil, and the company of family probably tasted better than any feast a king could imagine. While farming families ended their day surrounded by fields and olive groves, life inside Athens followed a very different rhythm. The city never seemed to stop moving. Potters shaped clay beside glowing kilns. Blacksmiths hammered iron until sparks filled the air. Carpenters sawed timber. Bronze workers polished helmets and statues. Merchants shouted prices from market stalls, while donkeys patiently carried goods through narrow streets, wondering why humans insisted on making everything so complicated. An artisan's family still ate simply, but they enjoyed one important advantage: choice. Unlike rural households, which relied mostly on whatever they could grow themselves, city families lived only a short walk from the agora, the bustling marketplace that served as the heart of Athenian life. Every morning, vendors displayed baskets overflowing with fresh vegetables, herbs, olives, figs, grapes, onions, garlic, and fragrant loaves of bread. Fishermen arrived carrying the night's catch, while cheesemakers offered fresh rounds of goats and sheep's cheese. Potters traded bowls for food, blacksmiths exchanged tools, and neighbours caught up on the latest news while pretending they had only stopped to buy onions. The marketplace fed both stomachs and gossip with remarkable efficiency. Breakfast remained fairly modest. Bread dipped in olive oil, fresh cheese, olives, and seasonal fruit were still common. But city families could often enjoy slightly fresher ingredients because they purchased food almost daily instead of relying entirely on stored supplies. Lunch was frequently light as well. Many craftsmen stayed close to their workshops, eating bread with cheese, olives, dried figs, or nuts between customers. There was little time for elaborate cooking when commissions needed finishing before sunset. A customer waiting for a new water jug was generally less patient than a loaf of bread. The evening meal, however, offered greater variety than many farming households could afford. Vegetable stews remained popular, but urban markets made seafood much more accessible. Fresh sardines, anchovies, sea bream, squid, mussels, and octopus regularly appeared on Athenian tables, especially for families who lived near the port of Piraeus. Fish was often less expensive than red meat and could be grilled quickly with little more than olive oil and herbs. Meat still remained an occasional luxury. Most artisan families did not regularly roast lamb or beef. Instead, pork, goat, or lamb appeared during religious festivals, family celebrations, or after public sacrifices, when portions of the animals were distributed among the community. These occasions transformed an ordinary dinner into something everyone remembered. Wine accompanied the meal, always mixed with water, according to Greek custom. As lamps flickered inside the house, conversation replaced the sounds of hammering and pottery wheels. The family discussed customers, politics, theatre performances, and rumours spreading through the agora. Athens was not simply a city of philosophers. It was a city where ordinary families gathered around familiar meals after another busy day of skilled work. Their table may have been slightly richer than that of a farmer, but it was still unmistakably Greek. Bread, olive oil, vegetables, seafood, cheese, fruit, and good company shared at the end of a hard-working day. The food on a farmer's table was shaped by the seasons. The food on a soldier's table was shaped by survival. Once a Greek soldier left his city behind, comfort became a luxury that stayed at home. Whether marching with an Athenian army, serving aboard a trireme, or standing shoulder to shoulder in a hoplite phalanx, every meal had to answer one simple question. Could it keep a man fighting tomorrow? Taste was appreciated. Calories mattered more. Unlike modern armies with organised supply trucks and field kitchens, Greek armies depended heavily on preparation, local supplies, and whatever they could carry themselves. Every extra pound slowed a soldier's march, so food needed to be light, durable, and resistant to spoilage. The most dependable companion was barley. Soldiers often carried roasted barley meal, known as alphata. It required almost no cooking. Mixed with a little water, wine, or olive oil, it became a filling paste that could be eaten within minutes. It was hardly the kind of meal that inspired poetry, but it was portable, nutritious, and could survive weeks inside a travel bag. Barley bread accompanied it whenever possible. Dense loaves travelled better than softer wheat bread and remained edible even after several days. If the bread became too hard, soldiers simply softened it with water, wine, or broth before eating. Olives were another favourite. They occupied little space, required no cooking, and provided valuable fat and salt. Alongside them came onions and garlic, foods that grew easily, travelled well, and added welcome flavour to otherwise repetitive meals. Ancient writers frequently mention soldiers eating raw onions, a habit that probably made enemy negotiations pleasantly brief. Cheese was equally important. Hard sheep's or goat's cheese lasted much longer than fresh dairy products and supplied protein during long campaigns. A soldier could slice off a small piece, eat it with bread and olives, and continue marching without slowing the column. Dried figs became one of the army's greatest sources of quick energy. Naturally sweet and easy to preserve, they were the ancient equivalent of an energy snack. Nuts, such as almonds and walnuts, often accompanied them, providing healthy fats and additional calories that marching men desperately needed. Fresh meat appeared far less often than many imagine. When armies stopped for extended periods, livestock might be slaughtered or game hunted locally. Religious sacrifices before battles also sometimes ended with communal feasts, allowing soldiers to enjoy roasted lamb, goat, or pork. But during ordinary marches, preserved foods remained far more practical than fresh meat. Water was the primary drink, though diluted wine was also common when supplies allowed. Besides improving flavour, wine mixed with water was often considered safer than drinking untreated water alone. When evening came, soldiers gathered around small campfires, sharing simple meals, much like the farming families back home. The surroundings had changed. The menu had become even simpler. But bread, barley, olives, cheese, olive oil, dried fruit, and diluted wine still formed the foundation of the meal. It was not a feast fit for heroes. Yet it was exactly the kind of food that allowed Greek armies to march hundreds of miles, stand firm behind walls of bronze shields, and fight battles that would shape the history of the ancient world. If a Greek soldier ate to stay alive, a wealthy Athenian sometimes ate to celebrate the fact that he did not have to march anywhere at all. For prosperous citizens, the evening meal was more than nourishment. It was a social event. Business partnerships were strengthened over dinner. Political opinions were exchanged between courses. Philosophers debated ideas, poets recited verses, musicians entertained the guests, and friendships were reinforced with every shared cup of wine. The meal usually began quite simply. Guests washed their hands before entering the dining room, an important ritual in a world where people had spent much of the day walking dusty streets. They then reclined on couches arranged around low tables, leaning on one elbow, while servants brought the first dishes. To modern eyes, eating while lying down might seem slightly inconvenient. The Greeks considered it civilized. Fresh bread appeared first, accompanied by bowls of olives, goat's cheese, nuts, figs, and small dishes of herbs. Olive oil was poured generously over many of the foods, while vinegar provided brightness without overwhelming the natural flavours. These appetizers encouraged conversation, rather than filling hungry stomachs too quickly. Then came the main courses. Unlike ordinary farming families, wealthy households could afford meat more frequently, although it still remained closely connected to religious sacrifice. Lamb, goat, pork, and occasionally beef appeared roasted over charcoal, seasoned with herbs such as oregano, thyme, and coriander. Rather than covering the meat with heavy sauces, cooks allowed the quality of the ingredients to speak for themselves. Seafood was equally prized. Large sea bass, red mullet, octopus, squid, oysters, mussels, and shrimp often arrived from the nearby port of Piraeus. Some expensive fish became symbols of status, with wealthy Athenians happily paying remarkable prices simply because they could. Apparently, showing off through food did not begin with celebrity chefs. Vegetables remained an essential part of the meal. Cabbage, leeks, onions, beans, lentils, cucumbers, and leafy greens appeared alongside the richer dishes, dressed with olive oil and fragrant herbs. Fresh fruit waited nearby, ready to cleanse the palate before dessert. When the main meal ended, the evening often shifted into the symposium. This was not another dinner course, but a gathering centered on conversation, philosophy, entertainment, and carefully mixed wine. Servants diluted wine with water inside large mixing bowls before filling each guest's cup. Drinking undiluted wine was widely considered a mark of poor self-control, while moderation reflected education and refinement. Musicians played the lyre or flute. Guests challenged one another with riddles, discussed politics, quoted Homer, or argued about philosophy with the confidence that only several cups of diluted wine can inspire. Dessert remained pleasingly uncomplicated. Fresh figs, grapes, apples, pomegranates, walnuts, almonds, and soft cheese drizzled with fragrant honey, concluded the evening. There were no towering cakes or elaborate pastries, just fresh, seasonal ingredients presented beautifully. Compared with a farmer's supper, this banquet was undoubtedly more luxurious. Yet despite the extra servants, finer ingredients and polished silverware, the foundations remained exactly the same. Bread, olive oil, wine, herbs, vegetables, cheese, fruit, and good conversation still sat at the centre of the table, proving that whether rich or poor, ancient Greeks shared far more in common than their meals might first suggest. Whether you were born into a farmer's cottage, an artisan's home, or the household of a wealthy merchant, one thing was certain. You did not get your own special children's menu. Ancient Greek children ate much of the same food as everyone else. The difference was usually the quantity, not the menu. Meals were family affairs, and children learned from an early age that eating was more than satisfying hunger. It was part of becoming a member of the household. They watched adults break bread, pour olive oil, offer thanks to the gods, and share conversation while passing simple dishes around the table. Food also taught responsibility. Older children often helped prepare it long before they were trusted to cook entire meals. Girls frequently learned to grind grain, knead dough, fetch water, tend the fire, and prepare vegetables alongside their mothers or older relatives. Boys might help gather olives, collect figs, herd goats, or bring firewood home before dinner. By the time they were teenagers, few kitchen tasks were unfamiliar. Breakfast for most children looked much like that of their parents. A piece of barley bread, perhaps softened with olive oil or dipped into watered wine, was common. Fresh goat's cheese might appear if the family owned livestock. During the right season, figs, grapes, or apples added welcome sweetness before the day's work or lessons began. Honey was an occasional treat rather than an everyday luxury. A drizzle over bread could transform an ordinary breakfast into something children remembered all morning. Lunch remained light. Children helping in the fields often carried bread, olives, dried figs, and cheese, eating wherever the adults happened to be working. Those living in cities might receive similar foods while assisting in workshops or attending lessons. There was little expectation of stopping for an elaborate midday meal. The evening meal brought everyone together. Children ate the same vegetable stews, lentil soups, beans, onions, cabbage, fish, and bread that filled the bowls of the adults. If meat appeared after a festival or sacrifice, children shared it alongside everyone else. There was no separate plate of chicken nuggets quietly waiting in the corner. Ancient Greek parenting could be many things. It was rarely that accommodating. Of course, infants required different care. Babies were breastfed whenever possible, sometimes for as long as 2 years. As they grew older, soft foods gradually appeared: porridge made from barley, mashed beans, softened bread soaked in water or goat's milk, and small amounts of fruit. Everything was introduced slowly as young stomachs adapted. Parents also understood that growing children needed nourishment, even if they lacked modern nutritional science. Milk, cheese, eggs, legumes, grains, fruits, and olive oil supplied much of what young bodies required. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about a Greek child's diet is how familiar it still feels. Fresh bread, fruit, vegetables, beans, cheese, fish, olive oil, very little processed food, very little refined sugar. It was a diet built almost entirely from ingredients gathered nearby, prepared at home and shared around the family table. Long before anyone spoke about the Mediterranean diet as one of the healthiest ways to eat, Greek children were quietly growing up on it, one simple meal at a time. Most days in ancient Greece, the family table was modest: bread, olives, cheese, vegetables, perhaps a little fish. But every so often, everything changed. The smoke rising from the city or village was no longer coming from ordinary cooking fires. It drifted upward from public altars, where entire communities gathered to honour the gods through festivals and sacrifices. These were the days everyone looked forward to, not only because they celebrated the divine, but because they also offered something many ordinary families enjoyed only a handful of times each year: a generous serving of meat. Religion and food were deeply connected in ancient Greece. When an ox, sheep, goat, or pig was sacrificed to a god such as Zeus, Athena, Apollo, or Demeter, the ceremony followed carefully established traditions. Certain portions of the animal, particularly the bones wrapped in fat, were burned on the altar as an offering to the gods. Priests received their customary shares. The rest did not go to waste. It became dinner. Large public festivals transformed entire communities into enormous outdoor dining halls. Families who rarely had the opportunity to eat roasted meat suddenly found themselves standing beside neighbours, craftsmen, farmers, sailors, merchants, and magistrates, all waiting for their portion. For many poorer citizens, these festivals provided some of the best meals of the entire year. The meat was roasted slowly over charcoal fires until the skin became crisp and the inside remained tender. There were no heavy marinades or complicated sauces. Olive oil, sea salt, oregano, thyme, and perhaps a little coriander were usually all that was needed. The quality of the meat spoke for itself. Around the roasting fires, enormous baskets of bread circulated continuously. Fresh loaves disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Bowls of olives passed from hand to hand. Goat's cheese, onions, figs, grapes, nuts, and seasonal vegetables completed the feast. Wine flowed freely. Although true to Greek custom, it remained carefully diluted with water before drinking. Nobody wanted a religious celebration ending with someone attempting to debate philosophy with a tree. Music filled the air. Flute players performed while singers recited hymns dedicated to the gods. Children ran between groups of adults. Merchants sold sweets made from honey and sesame. Athletes competed in games during larger festivals, while poets and actors entertained enormous crowds. Meals became something far greater than eating. They became shared experiences. Rich and poor often found themselves participating in the same celebration, eating from the same sacrifice, honouring the same gods. Social differences certainly remained, but for a few hours, an entire city could gather around the same source of food. Perhaps that explains why festivals occupied such an important place in Greek life. They nourished more than hungry stomachs. They strengthened friendships, reinforced religious traditions, celebrated successful harvests, and reminded every family that they belonged to a larger community.